All right, good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. My name is Mohsen Pasha. I'm the president of the St. Louis chapter of the Federal Bar Association. I want to start off by thanking Armstrong Teasdale for hosting, and in particular Angela Kennedy for setting everything up for us. I have been working on FBA CLEs for a number of years now, and I think this has to be one of the most hyped, excited, so much excitement built up around the CLE that we've had. I've had so many people reach out to me and say, family members were involved in these cases. I remember these cases. I was involved in these cases. This is part of St. Louis history. So for putting this program together, I have to thank Judge Albus for coming up with the idea and our panelists for being here. So with that, I will hand it over to Judge Albus. Thank you.
Well, just quickly, thank you for coming. Many of you know our panelists, but just to reiterate what Mohsen said, in the 80s, this was where it was at in St. Louis news. This was on the front page of the paper when the front page of the paper was it in terms of consuming news. And I hope you really enjoy it. Quickly, starting to my immediate right, Jim Crowe, graduate of Mizzou Law School, served as the criminal chief of the United States Attorney's Office for 40 years, served the Justice Department for more than 45 years, mentored many lawyers that came along in my generation. But when he was a young buck, came back to his hometown of St. Louis from the Justice Department, he was one of the laboring oars for these. Next to Jim, to his right, Judge Rick Buckles, served in the U.S. Attorney's Office during these cases, of course, then went on to serve for a long time, I would guess more than 20 years as United States Magistrate Judge until retiring. Again, one of the lead lawyers in these cases. And then to Judge Buckles' right, Tom Dittmeier. Tom Dittmeier, appointed by President Reagan to be the United States Attorney in 1981, served that term, ultimately left the office, which is a whole other CLE that he came back under United States Attorney Ed Dowd, served for another 20 years. You get a feel for the appeal of working at the U.S. Attorney's Office in St. Louis. When you hear those types of bios, they just have the type of work that you just can't do anywhere else in our community. And again, they've all helped so many young lawyers, put so many bad guys in jail. So enough of my talking. Let's leave it to them. Welcome to our panelists.
Well, thank you. I'm going to start out for the group. Thank you for coming. It was, I'm afraid that when he used the word hyped, that does strike some fear in our hearts up here, considering our level of preparation for it, but there's the preparation really goes back many years to the trials themselves. And in the case of Rick and Tom Dittmeier, the years it spent before the trials even started. I kind of came into this whole thing at the Leisure trial in January of 1985, when Bob Haar, who is here with us today, went into private practice, and I kind of took his seat at the table, and it's been an incredible experience. The background to this thing goes back a long way, but the key to the prosecution really was Tom Dittmeier becoming U.S. Attorney in August of 1981. A lot of, as we'll go through in a minute here, things were happening right in that time frame, and Tom had a tremendous reputation as a prosecutor as he came into the U.S. Attorney's Office, based on any number of highly celebrated murder cases in St. Louis City and St. Louis County that he had tried. And of course, you see above him John Wayne. That's his. Where is that in your house right now, Tom? Where's
In the basement.
In the basement. It was right. It was right. It was in the U.S. It was in his office in the U.S. Attorney's office. Believe me, that was prominent. He knows every John Wayne movie and can give you some dialogue out of those things. So there was a lot of publicity about these cases. There's just a little editorial cartoon when the case was indicted that showed Dittmeier's arm, strangling organized crime in St. Louis. So there was a lot going on, and when these cases were charged, there was tremendous amount of publicity. So here is just a headline on the indictment in April of 1983. Eight individuals indicted. You see the large picture there of Paul Leisure, who with his cane, as a result of him having been car bombed at his house on Nottingham near Kings Highway in South St. Louis. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Okay. A lot more about that. All right. Background of the case. Just a brief background. You had family situations and labor union situations that were involved, kind of parallel tracks to a certain extent. You have the Leisure family and the Michaels family, two Syrian families in St. Louis, the near South Side, St. Raymond's church in near south of downtown St. Louis, and that's the 7th Ward of St. Louis, or was the 7th Ward, was the 7th Ward going down into Seward. All right, so you have the Michaels and the Leisure family, and then you have an Italian faction headed up by Tony Giordano, famous name in St. Louis history. And the three families were involved in various ways with two labor unions, Laborers 42 and Laborers 110. And there was power struggles, who was going to control what. Tony Giordano, kind of the big man, because he had a national reputation. All right, so people kind of hesitated to do things that he would deem untoward. And so Paul Leisure did some enforcement for Giordano, but then their problems arose in the 70s and into the 80s. One of the family problems was that in 1964, Richard Leisure, one of the Leisure family members, was shot and killed in a bar in East St. Louis by one of the Michaels family members, a guy named Norm Peters, who I think played St. Louis basketball at St. Louis U at one point. Somebody told me. But then obviously that creates a problem. So you have, that comes into the play even into the trial itself, into the evidence at the trial. So you have that, and there was the Michaels family were able to kind of talk to the bar people at the bar where they wouldn't identify who the shooter was, et cetera, et cetera. So nobody was prosecuted for the murder of Richard Leisure, and that was a sore point for the Leisure family as time went on. So we have that, and through the 70s, then we have different percolating things with these unions. In 1979, a fellow named John Spica from the Italian side was killed with a car bomb by the Leisures, and they were, intent on doing more, but hesitated to do more until because of Tony Giordano being around. Tony Giordano had more clout nationally than his successor, who was John Vitale. In August of 1980, Tony Giordano dies a natural death. And so then the Leisure family starts making their move then, because they did not feel that John Vitale had the pop to concern them, basically, that they figured they could take over. This is basically what it came down to. All right, so we have in the indictment, the Leisure indictment then is count one, Paul Leisure, Anthony, Paul and Anthony are brothers. David is a cousin. Steve Wagaman and Bobby Carbo are David Leisure associates, and we'll get into what they did as we hit the predicate offenses. They were indicted on the RICO, which is Racketeer Influence and Corrupt Organization statute. That was kind of the big statute available at that time. RICO conspiracy, obstruction of justice, a murder of one of the participants who they feared was cooperating. He was not, but they feared he was, so he was killed. We'll talk about that. Another obstruction of justice count involving Steve Wagaman, whose brother-in-law worked for the phone company in the Leisures, and Wagaman used him, Innes Anderson was his name, to get some information, phone information, as they were trying to track various members of the Leisure family to try to track them down to kill them, basically. And then counts 5 and 6 are bombing cases. It's interestingly, it's a Treasury violation to make bombs, as it turns out, without permission from the government. And so you have the Michaels bomb and the Faheen bomb were counts in the indictment. All right, under RICO, Judge Buckles is going to talk much more extensively about what RICO is, but it's like a super conspiracy statute. Conspiracy is basically a partnership in crime. It has elements, of course, and RICO is what they call, the courts call it, a super conspiracy statute. And you need predicate offenses. You need a pattern of racketeering activity. You need an enterprise, meaning a group of people and who engage in a pattern of racketeering activity. And racketeering activity is defined as anybody's familiar with the statutes in the federal court, there's usually a huge laundry list of statutes that are included. But significantly in RICO, state law is brought in because they talk about a predicate offense is murder, generic murder, meaning state offense of murder. So here in the Leisure case, the predicate offenses were murder and obstruction of justice. So various predicate offenses. That September 17th, 1980, again, less than a month after Tony Giordano dies, less than a month, the Leisures hit James Michael Sr. With a remote control bomb on I-55 near Revis Barracks Road. Then time passes, August 11th, 1981, not a predicate offense. That's why it's in brackets. The Michaels respond by bombing Paul Leisure with a remote control bomb set off. They had it was down on South Kings Highway. He lived on Donningham, just a few blocks west of Kings Highway. Paul Leisure, they had a bomb in his car. It was going to go off by remote control. Two of the members of the Michaels clan were across Kings Highway to see him come out of his house. And they gave the high sign to two people on the street, would be probably Lansdowne or Murdoch, south of or north of Kings Highway, or north of Nottingham. And they gave the high sign to the people on there who were not, they could not see Leisure in the car, but when they got the high sign, they hit the button and it went off. And so Paul Leisure was injured when you saw his picture with the cane. So he was impaired, obviously, the rest of his life, not killed, obviously. The Leisures break into action quickly. September 11th, 1981, they were after John Michaels and an associate cousin of the Michaels clan, a shooting at the Edge restaurant. Anthony Leisure did the shooting. David was in a little outbuilding. David, Anthony, and was it Ramo? Was it the outbuilding? No, it wasn't there. The car nearby. But Anthony did the shooting, and Paul Leisure later on regretted that he didn't like that long distance stuff. He said that he preferred to hit him right in the forehead but Anthony was not that far away, but they hit him, they had a shotgun blast. So then they were doing surveillance on Sonny Faheen, who was a Michaels relative. His mom was a Michaels, lived in South St. Louis, he worked in the civil courts building in the city, had for years, a person known to a lot of the people who did work in that building. And they did a lot of surveillance on him. And then they had a detonated, ignition rated car bomb on his VW in the Mansion House garage on October 16th of 1981. Then the plot thickened. Michael Kornhart, who was a running buddy of David Leisure, was arrested pretty quickly by the police, and that triggered the Leisures being concerned about him being a cooperator. He was not cooperating, but he was a young guy, kind of a drug user. Did burglaries, took chances, did things that the older guys were not very happy about. And they were always concerned that he was cooperating and anyone. So he was then later on, as the investigation intensified and various people were being called into the grand jury, even though they took the fifth or whatever, and people were being contacted, they made the decision to kill Michael Kornhart, which they did on St. Charles, ostensibly a burglary. Bobby Carbo was the one doing the shooting, and he and Steve Wagaman, lured Kornhart up there on the guise of doing a burglary, and then shot him in the back of the head. All right, so quickly, Tony Giordano up there on the top left. No, he's on the top right. No, he's top left. And Jimmy Michaels is the one with the cigar. And then you have David Leisure when he was arrested with a police officer. And here is a couple of the vehicles. The Michaels vehicle at the top. Paul Leisure's Cadillac down at the bottom right. And the George Sonny Faheen VW bottom left. We can get it all kinds of other stuff, but we can, and there are a million different legal issues and some interesting tactical things that that emerged in the trial. But also, I think the background of all this would be very interesting for all of you to hear. So I'm going to I'm gonna back up and defer to Judge Buckles at this time. Take over.
I wanted to bore you with a little bit of the law. We prosecuted the Leisure case. The first trial we did was of Jimmy Michaels for the bombing of Paul Leisure, and he was charged with several offenses. He only got convicted of conspiracy to make a bomb, and he ended up getting 5 years on that case. There was a change of venue, as people have talked about here. The publicity was intense. I mean, every day there was something in the paper about this stuff. So there was a change of venue granted, and we, Tom and I went down and tried the case in Little Rock, Arkansas. That was the first case that we tried. Indicted along with Jimmy Michaels, the third, was a fellow named Milton Russell Shep, Russ Shep, who at the time was a chief of police of a small community in St. Louis County, St. George, Missouri. And he was a relative of the Michaels. His ex-wife was a Peters. She was a sister of Norm Peters and Bobby Peters. And that was really his connection with the family. But Tom will probably get into some of the evidence that we had against Shep, but he took off shortly after the indictment was filed. He left town. We later found out he was in California. He took his wife in a three-wheel motorcycle and drove all the way to California. He was out there for several months, and he ended up eventually coming back and surrendering. And we tried that case again, change of venue, and we tried that case in Kansas City, and Shep was convicted there in that case. And again, it had to do with the bombing of Paul. The Leisure case started out. Let me say there were several other people that worked on the case besides the three of us up here. A fellow named Kevin O'Malley was an assistant U.S. attorney. Kevin worked on obtaining the wiretap orders for the electronic surveillance that was conducted in this course of the investigation. The electronic surveillance of the LNNP, which was the company that the Leisures owned. It was a towing company located down on Shodo Avenue. There was a wiretap put in to that office and ran for 7 months. Got a lot of good information out of that. Kevin worked on that, put together with the assistance of some other people in the Justice Department, put together the affidavits and all the paperwork. Wiretaps are not easy to get approved, have to be approved by the Department of Justice, and they're not easy. And there's a lot of work that goes into it, preparing affidavits and follow-up reports and that sort of thing. Kevin handled all of that. Kevin eventually left the office, and the duties relating to the wiretap fell to Bob Haar, who's seated out here today. Bob took all of the wiretaps and went through every one of them. Okay, listened to every one of those tapes. 7 months worth out of just the LNNP. There was also a bug in Paulie Leisure's house that went on for several months. Bob listened to every one of those tape recordings and pulled out the ones that appeared relevant to the case, things that we might be able to use in evidence at a trial of the case. Once that was wrapped up, Bob left the office, and that pretty much left Tom and I. And we sure as hell couldn't do all this by ourselves. So we recruited a couple other people, including Mr. Crowe here, and Jim Stites. We put Jim Stites in charge of the wiretap stuff. And whenever we got to the point in a trial where we were going to use a wiretap, Jim would, had it all cataloged, would pull it out, play the tape that we were going to play. And we also had one other backup lawyer, Jim Martin. Some of you probably know Jim from, he moved on out of the U.S. Attorney's Office and went to Dow Bennett, and I think he's retired now. But Jim kind of was a backup guy for us. He didn't participate in the trial, but as sometimes evidentiary issues or something would come up during the trial, and we'd say, "Hey, Jim, we need some research. Get us some cases on this," and he'd run and do that and backed us up on that. Now, the wiretap anticipated that evidence would be obtained through the wiretap of violations of the RICO statute, the Racketeering Influence Corrupt Organization statute. That was a statute enacted by Congress in 1970, strictly for the purpose of being able to fight organized crime and fight it on the basis where it would be more than just picking off these cases one by one where, as they happened. That wasn't a very effective way to do it. So the RICO statute was enacted, really brainchild of a guy named Robert Blakey, who had worked in the Justice Department on some organized crime cases and later went to work for the Senate committee that was drafting the legislation. Later went on to become a law professor at the University of Notre Dame. The RICO statute provides that it shall be unlawful for any person employed by or associated with any enterprise engaged in or the activities of which affect interstate or foreign commerce to conduct or participate directly or indirectly in the conduct of such enterprise's affairs through a pattern of racketeering activity or collection of an unlawful debt. Now that's, now our case was was based on the people conducting this racketeering activity. Racketeering activity is defined in the statute as, well, there's 35 separate crimes that are listed that can be a predicate act for and identified as racketeering activity. For the purposes of our case, if you any act or threat involving murder, obviously, that worked for us. And the other offense which we dealt with was obstruction of justice. Both of those are defined as acts constituting racketeering activity. And an enterprise, racketeering enterprise, is defined as including any individual, partnership, corporation, associate, or other legal entity, and any union or group of individuals associated in fact, although not a legal entity. That was us, that last group. A group of individuals associated in fact, even though not any kind of legal entity. A pattern of racketeering activity requires the person commit at least 2 acts of racketeering activity within a 10-year period. And the conspiracy, the RICO Conspiracy Act says it shall be unlawful for any person to conspire to violate any of the provisions of subsection A, B, or C of the Racketeering Act. Ours was a C violation. To show an enterprise, you had to show 3 things. You had to prove that there was a common or shared purpose by the group. You had to show some continuity of structure and personnel in the group. And you had to show that there was an ascertainable structure distinct from that inherent in the proving of the pattern of racketeering. But the Supreme Court broadly interpreted the language and said that the proof of the racketeering activity may also coalesce and serve to prove the enterprise element. And that's very, very important. in order to show someone was a member of the conspiracy, all you had to show was that they agreed to become a member of the group, and that he knew that there were people in the group were had agreed themselves to commit 2 acts of racketeering activity. So that's what you had to show. Now, RICO at that time was a relatively new statute. The statute was enacted in 1970. It's a very broad statute. It allows you to prove things that you would never be able to prove or offer in evidence at the trial of an individual case. And because of the breadth of it, the Department of Justice was concerned, and there was a lot of opposition to the statute, concern, particularly among the courts. You see some of that language in some of these cases, particularly in the Flynn case. Judge Bright, obviously didn't care much for the RICO statute. But so in order to, the Justice Department was very protective of the use of the RICO statute. In order to bring a RICO prosecution, you had to first obtain approval from the Department of Justice. Back at the time that we were doing it, the approval had to come from the Deputy Attorney General in charge of the Criminal Division of the Department of Justice. In order to obtain that approval, you had to submit 2 things to the department. You had to submit a copy of the proposed indictment, RICO indictment, and you had to submit what's called a prosecution memorandum. And the memorandum had to include a summary of the facts of the case, a statement of the evidentiary basis for every allegation in the indictment, a statement of all of the applicable law, including evidentiary issues and things like that, a discussion of the anticipated defenses and or unusual legal issues in the case, and a statement of why a prosecution a RICO prosecution is necessary. The guidelines also say that a well-written, carefully organized prosecution memorandum is the greatest guarantee that a RICO prosecution will be authorized. I took them at their word. And I spent probably more than a month preparing a prosecution memorandum, much to the chagrin of Mr. Dittmeier, who was chomping at the bit and saying, let's go. Gotta get this done. So we submitted the proposed indictment in the prosecution memorandum, and we received approval immediately to proceed with the prosecution. And away we went. And looking back at this, I started my part of the investigation of this case on September 17th, 1980, when Michael Sr. was bombed. I had worked on a number of bombing cases in the past in the office, including I had just come off of prosecuting Glenn and Angle for the bombing case that he had participated in where he blew up Sophie Barrera. So I had developed a pretty close working relationship with agents of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. They have primary investigative jurisdiction in cases involving explosives. So I'd worked closely with them on a number of cases, but very closely with the Angle cases. They immediately became involved when Old Man Michaels was bombed, and we started working on that, but there wasn't a whole lot of stuff going on. And then in 1981, Tom was appointed as a U.S. attorney, and he made it clear that these organized crime activities, Paul Leisure had been blown up, were going to be a focus of work in our office. And away we went. And literally from September 17th of 1980 until the end of 1988, this is practically all I ever worked on, these cases. It was my life. My children still say, you know, gee, I wish I'd have known you in the eighties. But, and Tom's gonna talk about some of the work that we put in, and I mean, there were long days, long nights. And things were going boom, 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 boom. This stuff was happening and, you know, a lot of stuff going on. Tom,
Yeah, we worked so hard on that it was hard to get in any drinking time for a while. But we managed it.
we got a few in.
I was a state court prosecutor. I knew nothing about the U.S. Attorney's Office or federal law. And when I got appointed U.S. Attorney, I was sworn in on August 21st of 1981. But I'd met Rick earlier because I did the state side of that Engelman bombing up in Herman, Missouri. And Rick came up there and helped me with some of the nuances and whatever. And so we got a relationship. So obviously when I came in and we started on this, we worked pretty well together. I read a couple things I said the day I was sworn in about how we were going to solve the bombings and whatever. I didn't know what that's talking about, but we did anyhow. I did have a little background with some of these people though. Jimmy Michaels Sr., I'd met him personally a couple of times, and my mom's brother, my mother's brother, was an Egan gangster. And when Jimmy Michaels was a kid with the Cuckoo's gang, he used to drive cars for him, getaway cars and whatever for the Egan gang. And so I'd heard of Jimmy Michaels Sr. and whatever, and I met him a couple of times when he was being tried out in St. Louis County and talked to him. My mom's brother wound up buying Anthony Novelty Company from Tony Giordano. So I knew Tony Giordano, Shorty Ralph Kaleka, up closer, yeah, and John Vitale. So I knew who those players were. The name Leisure, the first time I ever heard that name, I was boxing at South Broadway back in 1963. And there was a guy who used to come down to the gym and box a lot, and he didn't show up for a while. And I asked, I wonder what happened to him. And somebody said, oh, Paul and Richard Leisure killed him. That's the first time I ever heard Paul Leisure's name. I was 18 years old. And then I knew he was a bodyguard for Tony Giordano because my uncle would talk about him and the various people. So that's sort of the background I had when I came into the case. But this thing was unbelievable. Giordano dies 8/29/80, and 17 days later, Paulie Leisure blows up Jimmy Michaels. Well, he couldn't do that before. Leisure was a bodyguard for Giordano. He got money out of Las Vegas that Giordano would give him. He did stuff with him, and Giordano and Old Man Michaels were tight, and so you couldn't touch Old Man Michaels with Giordano around. Once Giordano went out of the picture, though, Paulie said that, I mean, he made up his mind to kill him, and later on the wiretap, Paulie said, I lived for this. I always get my man. I waited 16 years for this. Well, 64, when Richard Leisure was killed, translates to 1980 was 16 years later. I mean, it was prophetic. And that's actually what precipitated it. And he was just going to take over everything. And so, I mean, 17 days later, they blew up Michaels. Somewhere during that period of time, John Vitale met Sarkis Webby Sr. set up a meeting for John Vitale, who was like the titular head of the mafia right then, with Paulie Leisure at the Mayfair Hotel, which we eventually got a wiretap over in the Mayfair Hotel, which came off of the original Leisure. And that wiretap was up a long time and led to a lot of the voting fraud prosecutions. But he tried to settle it down, but Leisure was greedy and he was going to take it all, and everybody was just afraid of him. His line to John Vitale is that Syrian business is Syrian business, Italian business is your business. And Tony Giordano had thrown that back at Leisure one time earlier, so it was kind of in your face. So that couldn't be settled. He was going to want to do what he wanted to. And what was interesting, the Michaels and the Leisures were always close together. And the Webbies were there too. And that was part of the problem with doing these cases. There were so many tentacles. There were tentacles into the police department through the politics on the one side, tentacles into judgeships. I mean, they had the political clout going, and then you had the Leisure just running wild, and everybody was covering up for them. So once that got started, the Michaels, they went to a function after Jimmy Michaels Sr. when he was blowing up. The Leisure group showed up at the wake. 7 of them were armed. They were all armed as a show of force, but they strutted through the wake and whatever and gave their condolences. And the Michaels were just waiting for their chance. And not long before Paul Leisure got bombed, there was some kind of function that the Leisures had. The Michaels went to it. And I think it was within about a week that Paul Leisure got bombed. And they used Russ Shep, who was the chief of police in Muni. And they brought in the Norm Peters back from California. And Isa, who was one of the original guys over there with Norm Peters when Richard Leisure got killed, was involved. And to show you how these things get so, Russ Shep, we tried him up in Kansas City, Rick and I did, and he got convicted. He got 15 years. And a number of years went by. He dropped me a letter one time and said, no hard feelings, because it was a real nasty cross-examination. But that's all he said. We got to a point, Dave Sinclair called me and he said, the car dealer, and he said, he's got a chance to get out if he can get a job. Are we going to be okay if I give him a job? I said, yeah, we're okay. So Russ Shep goes down and goes to work for Sinclair. And about 3 years after that, I bought a car from Russ Shep. So go figure.
He got a deal on it.
He let his wife start the car though.
But really, once Paul Leisure got bombed, that really is what brought down all of this, because the Leisure just went crazy. There was no rhyme or reason to it. They got real sloppy. And so after he got bombed, it was just a month later, I think on September 11th, 81 is when they shot Johnny Michaels down at the Edge restaurant. And that was another significant thing. Anthony went down there and they told you he had David with him and whatever. And they shot him with a shotgun, and they shot a guy that was with him, a work buddy that had nothing to do with any of this. I mean, they were brutal. And then Paulie was praising him, but upset. He says, you got to go up and shoot him in the head. You got to finish that. You know, but they didn't kill Johnny. But what's significant there is Prater, who was more of he was the main worker down there at the tow lot. I mean, he was the mechanic, he was the businessman. He kind of ran all that stuff, but he went out to the scene. He cut a wire fence and he pulled some boards down. He set up a shooting platform for him. And later, Paulie said, you know, who was doing what, and said, Sid don't do much, but Sid does what you ask him to do. That's what they call Prater. Well, as this went on, then after I got in there, they had the Edge shooting, and then October 16th of 81. So I hadn't been in there very at all, is when they blew up George Faheen down at the Mansion House. And he was like the deputy city clerk for the circuit court. And before that, Rick and I had him in the grand jury, and we both knew him. And he came to the grand jury, and what we wanted him to do, he was at the hospital the night that Leisure was blowing up. And that we wanted him to name who all showed up at the hospital. That's all we wanted. He was sweating. He was shaking like this. And we got in the hall and go, what the hell's wrong with him? I mean, we didn't have a clue that he was involved, but he was. And he testified, and then they blew him up on October 16th. So, so from there, things just really escalated, and it was shortly after that, in February of 82, we got the wiretap going. And in the wiretap is where Paul Leisure was talking one night and said how Prater had cut the wire fence. And And it was pretty good because the wiretap would be pretty static most of the week. And then on Friday nights, they'd get down there and start drinking long necks. And the drunker they got, the more they would talk. And they would talk about this. Paul Leisure would talk about beating up a guy. He started out at 6'1", 260, and by the end of the night, he was like 7 foot. He was like a giant. But they were saying some pretty significant stuff. And he mentioned that Prater had cut that wire. In the meantime, they were on there talking about Michael Carnhart, who had gotten arrested, and he got out on bond on the Mansion House deal. And they didn't have much on him at all. Somebody that fit the general description, but they arrested him. Well, they started talking about killing him. We had it on the wiretap, but the problem was the same lawyer represented everybody in this group. The same lawyer. So to go to talk to anybody, to go through their lawyer, they were going to know we had a wire up. So it was just kind of a moral dilemma that we batted it around. And so we sent 2 FBI agents to Michael Carnhart's parents' house. And they told him that, you know, we've had some informants and we've got informant information, and we think they're talking about killing your son. You need to talk to him, have him come in and talk to us. Well, we got to listen to him get talked into his death because he told them what happened on a wiretap. They all laughed. You know, they tell you that all the time. Don't pay any attention. That's just the FBI trying to do that stuff. And there wasn't any time at all. I got up and read the paper, and the body was found out in St. Charles County. And I just knew it was Michael Carnhart, and that's what it was. This Bobby Carbo and Wagaman, who were friends of David's, and Carnhart was a friend of David Leisure's. They offered to kill him, and they took him out there on the pretense of doing a burglary. And, you know, they got out. It was like out of The Godfather. They get out of the car to go walk somewhere, and then Bobby Carbo shoots him twice in the head and kills him. They leave him out there, and Fred Prater had made bond for him originally. So when they said that his driver's license was in his top pocket, somebody had identified him. Fred wasn't going to let him get killed like that. But Fred liked the kid, and it scared him to death that they killed this kid. And so he was getting more and more nervous. And we brought him into the grand jury, Fred Prater. And this was what really popped. He came in and he didn't take we gave him immunity. He was going to take the 5th. We gave him immunity, and he testified, and I asked him about that wire cutting, and he lied about it. So when he got finished, I took him, I gave him a subpoena for 2 weeks. I said, I know you lied in there. I'm gonna let you come back and recant that. I said, or else you're going to penitentiary. And we didn't hear anything from him. And then 2 weeks later, about 2 days before the date, it's a Sunday night. I go to bed. My phone rings at 2 or 2:30 in the morning. I said, Dittmeier, are you the U.S. attorney? What, Fred? What do you want? And I can't identify voices, but this guy had a raspy. There was no way. He goes, they're going to kill me. I'm leaving town. Well, what had happened? He was scared to death. And that was Anthony and Paulie, wasn't it? That came up to Allie. They wanted to go take him for a ride and do some talking, and he knew that it was going to happen. So I said, you can't. He says, I'm leaving. He says, my house is black. I'm sitting in here on the floor on the phone. And he said, I'm going tonight. And I said, well, you're going to get charged with that. He says, I will call you in the morning. I promise you. Well, I did. So he left. And that night, and sure enough, the next morning he called me and wanted to meet me out at the old Diamonds out in Cuba, Missouri, and a restaurant. And so Rick and I didn't know what was going on. So we called ATF, and they sent some agents out there. Our relationship with ATF was so good. We talked to the agent, this Jim Elder, and he goes, well, name who you want out there. So we just picked our people. And so we had people out there. They told us where to park on the lot and whatever. And Rick and I go in there and we're waiting. And we didn't know what was going to happen. So here comes Fred and his wife and his 83-year-old mother on a walker. I go, well, it's not going to be a hit. I think we're safe for now. So he came in and said he'd cooperate. But but he wanted immunity and various other things. And so ATF took him and we went back to the office and then they called us and they had him in a motel out in Warrenton, right off the road, where Rick and I could go out the highway. We could get off and get up in a parking lot. And then they could see across the road and make sure nobody got off and nobody's following us. And then we come over and we go interview him. And that night, when they're talking to him, and he was just a blockhead. He insisted on immunity. I want to cooperate. He's going and his wife's there. And finally, was it midnight maybe? It was
Yeah,
late.
It was late.
I just get up and I go, Ruth, tell this dumb son of a bitch, he's got 10 minutes or he's going to the penitentiary. It's just that locked in. And we walked out in about 8 minutes. She says, he'll talk to you. We walk in. And I know some of you have done it. Anybody that's ever had somebody go like that, they start like, well, yeah, and they'll give you something and you know they know more and you just keep dancing with them. So he's gonna tell me, I got my pen here, and he starts out, he goes, well, I built a bomb for Jimmy Michaels. And I just stopped. I didn't want to break the moment. I was afraid to write. I go, I've never had this happen before. And he just started spewing stuff and we briefed him and whatever, and there was so much stuff. He could go back 30 years on crimes. The guy had so much information. And once he cooperated, it was completely, I mean, there was no ifs or ands. He was on board. And so I went over the basics with him and I told him we were going to put him in the grand jury, but he would sometimes just get running off so fast. And so I just told him about 5 things I need him to say in the grand jury to give us enough for our indictment. I mean, we could put him back in there, and I told the grand jury we'd probably put him back in there. But the day we took him up to the grand jury, he goes in there, and when he does, he has to let his lawyer go. So he fires the lawyer, gives him the letter, and we go in and Fred's going to testify. Well, one of the things, and I still don't understand Rico, Rick wants to slap me in the head all the time. He's explained it to me 5 times. I tried the case. But anyhow, I knew enough. And one of the things, though, you have to show an organization, identifiable organization. Well, the lawyer goes and calls from the courthouse, and there weren't cell phones. He calls the lawyer that represented the whole group. He calls Paulie Leisure and said, Fred fired me. He's up in the grand jury. I think he's testifying, and there is security everywhere. I mean, there were people we had people everywhere. And then Leisure's asking about how much security, and they discussed that. And then Leisure, Paul, the head of it, calls his brother Anthony, number 2, tells him. Anthony then calls David. It went right on down the line. We had our structure there on the wiretap. And so, and at some point there was talk about them coming down, and Rick and I in the grand jury, and we got Fred sitting there, and you hear a shotgun rack in the hallway. I mean, this one juror back there, he just like this. And later he said, I knew what that was.
Heard that. I know what that was. We had to tell him, I had to tell him, you can't go anywhere. Okay, you're gonna have to stay here. You can't leave. Okay, and they're all kind of looking around, and then at that point, that's, you know, that was a deputy marshal out in the hallway, and he racked a shotgun. I don't know why, but that kind of got everybody's attention.
Yeah, it was tense. But from there, ATF then took Fred. He had so much information and you didn't know what to do with him because he wasn't charged. There was a priest that lived out in Warrenton, back down more towards Marthasville, and he had an A-frame. And he gave them the A-frame, and that's where Fred and his wife lived for several months. They had a wire around there, a tripwire and whatever. But we go out there and spend hours talking to him and just debriefing him. I mean, he told me I was familiar with some murders who I thought other people did it, and he told me who really did it. So an interesting one he told us about, there was a killing out in the Wellston. One of the Michaels kids had been killed at a high school party, and he was charged, but he made bond. And he had to be killed. And a red Cadillac went out to this tavern and 3 guys came in and they killed this kid who was on bond and killed the guy with him at the table. Well, there was a guy by the name of John Paul Shook who also got blown up later, but that was unrelated to this. Everybody thought he did it, but Fred said it was Paul Leisure. And we went back, we looked at the case and it literally was him, but it was Faheen and Jimmy Michaels Jr. And then Paul Leisure. Then later, Paul Leisure kills Michael Jr.'s father and kills Faheen's son. So I mean, it was just so incestuous. But they went in there and killed these kids and Fred said that Paulie was, really downplaying Michaels Jr. because he shot a guy at the table, but he ran and jumped behind the bar and he wouldn't even chase him down. And then Paul says, I went over and shot him in the ass and shot him in the head. Well, we got the pictures from the crime scene from back in the 60s. And there was a guy behind the bar. That's exactly what happened. So that Fred just gave us so much stuff. He was invaluable. Now, another thing, when you get a witness like Fred, you got to take care of him for a while. You're not really locked in for a while. And the one thing his wife insisted on was they left at night and they left their parrots in the house. So, and I don't know what the liability is on something like this, but we had the FBI or ATF agents go out and said, you got to get the parrots, but they didn't want anybody to know that Fred had left the house. So they go in at night and they got pin lights and they're going to get these parrots out of the house. The only thing is the parrots had gotten out of the cages. So they got these 2 giant parrots in there and they were meaner than hell. And by, this would be on Saturday Night Live, but the agent that's there to get him, his nickname is Bubba. And so he's calling and he's got and then we're calling Fred, what do you do? Well, you got to get a wet blanket. You got to get towels, you put them over me. So they captured these 2 parrots. The next morning I come into my office, it's like 7 o'clock in the morning. I open the door and I got these 2 big damn parrots and they're squawking in there or whatever. But no, that ATF was just invaluable to us in those cases. And when did we finish that case?
Which one?
The Leisure case, the actual,
January of 85. we started.
January of 85.
January of 85.
Got worked about
January
April 1st.
29th, we
So-
began the trial. It ended on April 2nd, 19.
So I got there in August of 21st. Rick and I tried Jimmy Michaels in October of 82 on a bombing. The next spring, we tried Shep on a bombing. And then we tried this. We had all the balls in the air at one time. And it was really, really hectic. Another thing that when we had the trial, they had some heavy hitter lawyers come in. And things happened at the trial. That was just unbelievable. First of all, we had individual voir dire when we tried them. And the lead lawyer there was about as good a lawyer as I've seen. This Krieger was his name. And then they had another hotshot from Tennessee by the name of Richie. And the rest were local lawyers. And they insisted on a change of venue. And they said maybe not if they could have individual voir dire. And the judge had absolutely no control over this voir dire. They literally would have voir dire, people up there crying to where they would finally say, I couldn't do it. I couldn't be fair. But there were women crying and whatever, and you'd go up and you'd object to what they were doing. There were so many people that went off, and any juror, this is what always galled Jim. There was a lady there who had a husband and a son who were policemen and maybe somebody else. Every other answer she answered properly. Well, the judge would go, well, put that one on hold, put that one on hold. We call it the Wednesday morning massacre. Everybody had on, 13 people or something?
More than that. Yeah, more
But
than that.
they should have never, most of them should have never been off that jury. They wiped them off. So we wind up with a 12th juror. And she held the jury up for weeks. And I knew I didn't want her because she said, oh, but I don't have any trouble. I make life and death decisions every day. I take pap smears. Now, if that's not being full of yourself, I don't know, man, that's gal. And, but we just got that at the end of the line. We couldn't do it. So then we get the jury and we go back in and, after they got their individual voir dire, they renew their motion for a change of venue, and we talked about it, and then Jim goes, we're gonna concede, we're going along with it, because we don't see after what happened here today that we can get a fair trial. What did Rosie say? We got a problem?
Oh, Judge Philippine
Judge Philippine.
called his secretary
Rosie.
on the phone, Rosie, everybody, Rosie, he goes, Rosie, there's been a dramatic development.
I could see it happening. And Krieger said, I've been blindsided. Nay, I've been double blindsided.
Yeah, it was dramatic.
We're gonna go to Cape, remember, Tom?
Yeah.
Judge Wangland said, I got a jury for
We
you.
had it lined up.
But it got their attention. It was like checkmate, okay?
Then Krieger goes, well, we have to talk to our clients. And then he comes back in and he had this big baritone voice and he goes, Judge, I've talked to my client. Not only does he want the trial to stay here, he demands that it stay here. Here we are. So we went from there. And when we indicted him, we had that wiretap still up and they picked everybody up except David Leisure. But we picked up on the wiretap. He was being hidden by Sarkis Webby Jr. over at a Mayfair hotel and he was dressed like a woman. And they snuck him out in a laundry basket. I think they caught him the next day or 2 days later. But they're the Webbies, they're aldermen. They were heavy hit politicians there and they were all over this. And then eventually that wiretap over in their Mayfair, we went from there into the vote fraud cases and whatever. So it just kept giving. But another thing, David Leisure. I always said David wasn't very smart, but out of all of them, he was a true criminal. There was no crime too big or too small that David wouldn't do. David would go do a murder, but he'd also go steal a candy bar. He just couldn't help himself. After they bombed Jimmy Michaels Sr., they had the device wasn't working, so they kept getting too close. Well, they had debris all over their car. So they went over into Illinois on Highway 3 and came back up. And they got the car washed and they got everything taken care of, but underneath the windshield wipers, there was crap. They just couldn't get off. They were afraid. So they go to a place where they had an account. And Anthony Leisure gives David like a $20 bill and says to David, go in and get wipers for us, but do not get them on our account. Don't get them on our account. Pay cash for them. David goes, okay. Well, after we start talking to Fred Prater and then this John Ramo turned, he took 16 years and testified and Broderick took 18 years and testified, but they talked about the events and they talked about the wiper thing. So these ATF agents go, I mean, this is years later, they go over there and they go through that deal over there and they find on their account these wiper blades bought within about an hour of the bombing and all the time. I mean, at the exact same time. So when we're trying them and we get to that point, David Leisure's lawyer says, my client has to go to the bathroom. And he doesn't care if the trial proceeds without it. So he didn't have to sit there and have them guys looking at him because he knew what was coming on that.
The thing is Anthony had given him $20 to buy the windshield wipers. And David pocketed the 20 and put the wipers on the charge account of LN&P. And that's the only reason that the place of business still had a record of it, because it was a charge. If it had been a cash, there'd been no record of it. They weren't real happy about it.
And those are the things that, once some guys started turning, there wasn't one witness there that if they told you this story, you probably would have put them on. Other than everything they were saying, it just seemed like we would come up with something like that to corroborate them, something to where you just knew it was true right down the line. So we put probably thousands of hours in these cases and whatever, but there was also a lot of luck involved. Things broke our way. So, but
Tom, let me say something about Fred, real quick on just kind of a lawyer point. Fred Prater was a key witness, first cooperator, to testify. And so, Tom is one of his great, talents really in trial lawyers. He's a minimalist, number one. In other words, to take get what you need out of somebody, but don't expose them in any way, if at all possible, to more cross-examination than they should. So with Fred did a great job on the stand, but he got cross-examined, and he was involved with a lot of stuff, and took some hits in cross-examination with 5 or 6 lawyers cross-examining him. And so he finished testimony on a Friday, and Judge Philippine would allow closed business if everybody was being good boys and girls, in court. He'd close business at noon or so on Friday and let people travel, the out-of-town lawyers go home, et cetera. So Fred finishes his Tom finishes, all the crosses are done. So then we have to decide whether we're going to do a redirect on Fred. All right, now again, you're talking about a lot of facts involved with these people. And so heavy discussions of everybody involved at the case, and Tom made the decision. He said, no redirect of Fred. And so that's incredible, because these witnesses take hits, and you always want to go up and solve that problem one way or another, And so that Monday morning we go into court, he stands up and says, Your Honor, no redirect of Fred Prater. And I mean, the shoulders on the defense lawyers just sagged, okay? I mean, because they were all gunned up, ready to go again with what they did. So that was
Fred was a time bomb, though. He was dangerous for everybody up there. At one point, he was cross-examined, and they go, well, have you ever made a bomb before? He goes, only the Yabusi job.
Yeah. That was a throwaway line. Unbelievable. Yeah, just that.
That was just a scare bomb. That wasn't about it.
Yeah.
Then he was asked, with Carnhart, well, didn't you warn Carnhart? Didn't you tell him? He goes, me warn Carnhart? Paulie shot me in the head. He shot me in the head, so he was real animated and just over the top. He went into witness protection, and he kind of broke the rules. He stayed kind of in contact with me, and he wound up developing like a multi-million-dollar business. And then the last time I heard from him, he sent me a thing, and he says, Mr. Dittmeier, you like to hear this? I was in the newspapers again, and this time not for being arrested. And it shows him like on a mini yacht with these 2 young girls. He's got his shirt open like this. He's got to be 70 years old. They're about 22, So.
So, Tom, another interesting thing, but this is the generational difference between Paul Leisure and Anthony on the one hand, and David on the other hand. Paul and Anthony were older. Anthony very careful, very little on either wiretap, very little, minimal on either wiretap. He was very conscious of problems. But David's younger, and he was a drug user, and he hung with Bobby Carbo and Steve Wagaman and Carnhart, and they did burglaries. They took chances. They were out there getting strung out a little bit, and that irritated the older guys, the Fred Prater, Joe Broderick, the old guys, the Paul Leisure level guys. And so when push came to shove, and that's not the only reason they cooperated, obviously being irritated about these guys taking chances, but it was one of the things that they would talk about, when Fred Prater saw that David had Carbo and I think Wagaman or maybe Carnhart looking at a VW on the premises of L&P Towing, a similar car to what George Faheen had, so they could determine how the bomb could be put in quickly. They would steal a car just like the car, like the Michaels car. They stole a car just like it, and then they worked on it at the L&P and determined where you could put the bomb, et cetera, so you could do it quickly. You wouldn't be sitting there fiddling around, taking an extra 5 minutes doing it. And once Prater saw that the young guys, that David had these young guys looking at the Faheen thing, it irritated him. It really irritated him, because he said, these guys, they're dangerous. They're dangerous out there. They could get caught, and they ultimately do get caught, But so it was a generation.
Interrupt, Jim, we're over time though. Thanks to Armstrong Teasdale. They're going to have a get together afterwards. We can talk about this all evening, but thanks to our panelists for their presentation. And there's a reception right after, so you can buttonhole them and ask them more questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
anybody cares to see it, there's a drawing of the trial. Cameras weren't allowed in the courtroom or anything, so that we had some artists that drew pictures of everything that was in the newspapers every day. And one of the guys finished one off and gave it to me. You're welcome to take a look at it if you want.
Your chambers, Judge?
Actually, we tried the case in what eventually became my chambers when I was appointed magistrate. So.